because he lives. All fear is gone, because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives. Amen. Well, good morning. Do you remember, I think it was on, I can pull it up here, I think it was on Friday in the Sabbath school lesson. It was Friday, July the 4th, the Sabbath school lesson. There was an inside story. Anybody read it? It was about this little boy named Peter in Zambia. Anybody read that story? Let me just summarize it, okay, because it was I read it and it was a very interesting story. It said, Peter Siami Kobo enjoyed digging for rats in the mountainous village in Zambia. The boy and his family ate the rodents with maize meal porridge at mealtime. They also enjoyed eating pigs and bubblefish. Pork was always on the table at Christmas, and bubblefish was popular for its boneless meat. So it came as a surprise to Peter when he learned that the Bible prohibited his favorite meats. And he heard about unclean food for the first time when he traveled about 20 miles from his hometown to visit his brother, who worked at a farm operated by Seventh-day Adventist missionaries. He stayed for Sabbath worship services, and the preacher spoke about the clean and unclean animals of Leviticus 11. And Peter realized that he and his family were following a meal plan that did not match the Bible's teaching. So after a while, the missionaries began to hold worship services in Peter's elementary school on Sabbath afternoons, and he attended the meetings even though he had to walk 2 miles to reach the school. His parents discouraged him from going and reminded him that he had been baptized as a baby. His father even ordered him to work on the family farm on Saturdays, but Peter didn't know anything about the Sabbath observance, and he quickly did his work in the morning, and he got to the afternoon meeting. In high school, Peter made friends from Adventist families, and he studied the Bible with them and gave his heart to Jesus in baptism by immersion. He stopped eating rats, pork, and bubblefish. Over time, his parents grew to appreciate the seventh-day Sabbath, and they understood why he didn't eat unclean meat. Every Sabbath that he was at home, they encouraged him not to be late for Sabbath school. I thought that was a really interesting story. It kind of grossed me out at first that they were catching rats and eating them, and but it reminded me of a recent experience I had with unclean food. And right about the time that this story came out, I hadn't read it yet, but we were up in the mountains in Colorado, and we were camping with family members. And one morning, one of my nieces came to me and she said, Aunt Diana, I'm going to make breakfast this morning because you always do everything. You always host us. And she says, you're always working hard. I want to make breakfast for you, so don't worry about it. And I said, okay. So I said, well, I'll cook the potatoes. And so while I was in the camper, I was making the potatoes, and they were all over at their campsite. And we were quite a ways away because we were down by the river, and they were kind of closer under a different section. Alex knows that area. So finally, everything was done. They called me over, and I went over and met them, and all the food was on the table, and there was scrambled eggs and potatoes and fruit and just everything for a beautiful breakfast, So I was serving myself, and I noticed the scrambled eggs had these like dark bits in them, and I thought, what could that be? Was it pepper? I kind of knew in my mind it was probably bacon bits, because. And later I realized they had cooked the eggs in bacon in the same pan they had cooked the bacon in, right? So I thought, what am I going to do, So I had served myself already, and I have to admit, I did take a bite of the eggs, and then I ate everything else in quite kind of like, made conversation and went on. So then we went back to the trailer, and I was cleaning up, and then I started feeling terrible, just terrible, like sick to my stomach. And my husband came, and he goes, "What's the matter?" And I said, I think they cook those eggs in bacon grease. I really do. And he goes, "Oh, I wouldn't doubt it." And he goes, because everybody in the family, they eat bacon, there's no thing, And I thought about it, and I thought I shouldn't have eaten it. It was probably a good opportunity for me to talk about clean and unclean food. But at the same time, it's like, sometimes when you do and you're in a large group and they're all used to eating what they eat, how do you just, talk about clean and unclean food? So anyway, the day went on. We had a nice time. I recovered from eating those eggs. And the next day, there's a church across the street from the campground. And it's a community church, and they were having a big fish fry, right? So we said, "Oh, let's go to this fish fry. They're probably going to have trout," because we were having luck that weekend catching fish. Unbelievable. For 3 years, we couldn't catch a fish, and then that day we were catching fish all over the place. So we went over to the fish fry, and there was lots of people there, and it was that weekend when they had the terrible, terrible floods in Texas. So it was a fundraiser, so they were going to donate all the money, to the people in Texas, who were victims of that flood. So we get up there, and they had this huge spread of salads and several kinds of beans and hush puppies. And I'm like, hush puppies? Well, there were a lot of Texans there, so, they eat hush puppies. And they had catfish. And I'm like, catfish? Oh, here we go again. So I grabbed my plate, and the guy wanted to serve me catfish, and I said, "No, thank you." "Oh, come on, this catfish is great. You've got to try it." And and there's a whole line of people, and I said, no, thank you. I'm not going to eat any catfish, but I appreciate it, So we went and sat down, and my husband and I were just cracking up laughing. He goes, "Why would they serve catfish?" And I said, "Because they're from the South. They're Texans, and they eat catfish." Anyway, it was kind of a funny weekend because this kept recurring, But I do want to say that, I was baptized in 2010, and I had heard about the health message a few years before that, but not that long. I had not been introduced to it. So I learned it, right, of course, within the year for sure, when I read Leviticus about what is clean and unclean. And I felt that it's really a good message. And it was a good reminder for me when I ate those eggs why God gave us those instructions. Probably not everybody would get sick from eating those eggs like I did. My husband didn't. Nobody else did, but they're all used to it, and it's in their diet, Anyway, but I do feel the instructions in Leviticus are crucial for a long and healthy life. And then somebody had brought up the blue zones in the world. I don't know if anybody's familiar with blue zones, but Loma Linda, California is one of the blue zones in the world where people live long and healthy lives because of healthy living and eating. So I thank God for providing us the health message, because I really think it does make a difference in our lives. And maybe for me it was a good reminder that day to, be reminded about eating something that I probably shouldn't have, and maybe I should have taken the opportunity to talk about clean and unclean food. It made everybody mad probably, but that would have been okay. They're family, so they overlook things I say. But anyway, in Leviticus, if you want to turn to Leviticus real quick, just a quick reminder about, it's Leviticus 11. Foods permitted and forbidden. And it was interesting when I started reading this, because I thought, we're talking about Moses right now, in Sabbath school. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, we're at Leviticus 1, "These are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof has cloven hooves, and chewing the cud that you may eat. Nevertheless, you shall not eat among those that chew the cud, or those that have cloven hooves. The camel, because it chews the cud, but does not have a cloven hoof." Same with the horse. "It's unclean to you. The rock hyrax," I think that must be some kind of a goat, the rock hyrax. I've never looked it up. "Because it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves. because it's unclean to you. And then it goes on about the hare and other animals. And then there's a whole paragraph about what's in the water, you know. And, you know, catfish for sure. I don't think have scales or fins, and they're pretty ugly anyway, but people love it. I don't know, but they talk about in verses, and then in verses 13 through and then 20 through 23 talk about the birds and the insects. And I thought that was interesting because you can eat grasshoppers and, what's the other one? Grasshoppers and crickets. Why? Because their leg is bent at a certain point in their leg, so you can eat grasshoppers and who used to eat grasshoppers and crickets? John, right? John, locusts, St. John the Baptizer, yeah. And then again, they talked about reptiles, that we don't eat reptiles, although they didn't go into a lot about reptiles, but it made sense to me as well. And anyway, thank you for listening. And, you know, for me it was a lesson to have that little experience with unclean food, and you know, it gave me a lot to think about, especially in the future when this happens again, because I know it'll happen again, because we go camping together a lot as a family, and they always cook bacon and stuff, and maybe I can find the right opportunity to share what I know about healthy food and clean and unclean food. Amen. Thank you.
Good morning. Whoops. Happy Sabbath.